History remembers the thunder. The roar of tank divisions crossing borders, the shadows of bomber fleets blackening the sky, the clash of great navies on steel-blue oceans. We are taught the war through its epic battles: Stalingrad, D-Day, Midway, El Alamein. These are the hinges upon which the world turned. But this is not the only history of the Second World War. Beneath the thunder of the front lines, a different war was being fought. A war of whispers, of forged documents, of invisible armies and impossible choices. A war waged in secret, in darkened rooms, by men and women whose names would never be known, but whose actions would save millions of lives. These are not the stories of grand armies. These are the stories of secret operations, of audacity, deception, and intelligence. The operations that, in the shadows, truly turned the tide. These are the stories you've never been told. In early 1942, the tide of war was overwhelmingly in favor of the Axis. In the Pacific, the Empire of Japan was a seemingly unstoppable force. Following the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, all had fallen. The Allied navies had been crushed. The Japanese Navy, with its peerless pilots, superior Zero fighters, and colossal battleships, believed itself invincible. And its commander, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was planning one final, decisive blow. A blow designed to lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap and destroy it, securing Japanese dominance for a generation. The target? A tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific, Midway. Yamamoto's plan was brilliant. It was also complex, involving multiple fleets, diversions, and a precise timetable. He believed the Americans were blind. He was wrong. In a windowless, humid basement in Pearl Harbor, a team of cryptanalysts known as Station Hypo was engaged in a desperate race against time. Led by the eccentric, brilliant, and often bathrobe-clad Commander Joseph Rochefort, this team was listening to Japan's most secret communications. They were attempting to break a code the Japanese considered unbreakable: JN-25. It was a painstaking, grueling process. The code was a super encryption, a code built on top of another code. But piece by piece, by identifying patterns, recognizing call signs, and making inspired leaps of logic, Rochefort's team began to read the mail. In May 1942, they intercepted a flurry of messages about a major upcoming offensive. The target was designated by a code, AF. The Japanese were going to attack AF. But where was it? In Washington, Naval Command believed AF was in the South Pacific, or perhaps even the U.S. West Coast. But Rochefort, studying the patterns of signals, was convinced AF was Midway. He had to prove it. This is where one of the war's most simple yet brilliant deceptions took place. Rochefort knew the Japanese garrison on Midway would monitor local American radio traffic. He instructed the U.S. base on Midway to send an unencrypted, plain text message. A message complaining that their water purification system was broken. They were critically short on fresh water. 2 days later, Station Hypo intercepted a new Japanese message. It read, AF is short on water. They had him. Admiral Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now had a choice. His advisors in Washington were skeptical. His forces were shattered, numbering only 3 aircraft carriers, 2 of which were badly damaged, against Yamamoto's grand armada of 8 carriers and dozens of battleships. Conventional wisdom said to fall back, to protect Hawaii. Nimitz bet on his codebreakers. He ordered his carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to sail to Point Luck, a patch of empty ocean northeast of Midway, and lie in wait. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese strike force arrived. Their planes bombed the island, just as planned, but their primary target, the American fleet, was nowhere to be found. And then the trap was sprung. American scout planes found the Japanese carriers. In the span of just 5 minutes, one of the most devastating and decisive 5 minutes in human history, American dive bombers, catching the Japanese fleet at its most vulnerable moment, turned all 4 of the Japanese carriers into blazing, sinking infernos. In less than a day, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost its 4 best carriers, its most experienced pilots, and the initiative in the Pacific. It was a wound from which they would never recover. The Battle of Midway not just stopped the Japanese advance, it reversed it. The tide in the Pacific had turned, not by a battleship, but by a broken water purifier and a handful of men in a basement who had learned to listen. While the war raged in the Pacific, an even darker shadow loomed over Europe. In 1939, just before the invasion of Poland, German scientists had achieved the unthinkable. They had split the atom. They had discovered nuclear fission. The implications were terrifying, and the Allied command knew it. A Nazi Germany armed with an atomic bomb would be unstoppable. It would mean the end of civilization as we know it. The race for the bomb was on, and the critical ingredient in the German-led race was a substance called heavy water. This was essential for moderating a nuclear reactor, and the only place in the world producing heavy water in industrial quantities was a single fortress-like factory perched on the edge of a 600-foot gorge in Nazi-occupied Norway. The mission to destroy it was deemed impossible. The British first tried a commando raid in 1942, Operation Freshman. It was a disaster. The 2 gliders carrying the commandos crashed in a blizzard. The survivors were captured by the Gestapo, tortured, and executed. The Allies then turned to a small group of Norwegian nationals, part of the Special Operations Executive. These men were not just soldiers, they were locals. They knew the terrain, they could blend in, and they were burning with a cold fury to liberate their homeland. The operation, codenamed Gunnerside, was led by 23-year-old Joachim Ronenberg. In February 1943, he and his small team parachuted onto the Hardanger Plateau, one of the most desolate and unforgiving wildernesses in Europe. For weeks, they lived in a hunting cabin, surviving a blizzard that nearly killed them, eating reindeer moss to stay alive, all while meticulously planning their assault. They were ghosts in the snow. The Vemork plant was a fortress. It was guarded by German troops, surrounded by minefields, and the only way in was across a heavily guarded, single-lane suspension bridge. The team decided the bridge was a suicide trap. The only other way was the impossible way, down the 600-foot sheer gorge, across the frozen river below, and up the icy cliff face on the other side. On the night of February 27, 1943, under the cover of a dark, moonless night, they began their descent. It took hours. They climbed down, forded the river, and began the treacherous ascent up the cliff, arriving at the plant's perimeter unseen. They were now inside the fortress, but the most dangerous part was ahead. Ronenberg and another commando, Frederick Kaiser, found a small duct for cables and squeezed through, entering the main production facility. They found themselves in the heavy water production room. Inside, they encountered a single Norwegian night watchman. The man, startled, nearly raised an alarm, but the commandos, speaking in his native Norwegian, calmly told him to get to safety. They methodically laid their explosive charges, connecting them with short 2-minute fuses. Not long fuses to ensure they could get away, short fuses to ensure the job was done. They lit the fuses and ran. The charges detonated with a dull, muffled thud. Not the massive explosion they had expected, but the sound was deceptive. Inside the plant, the blast had been perfectly contained, directing its full force downwards. It obliterated the heavy water electrolysis chambers, spilling 18 tons of the priceless, irreplaceable fluid into the drains. The German guards, hearing the noise, rushed to the bridge. They searched for the attackers, expecting an assault from the front. But the commandos were already gone, melting back into the darkness, climbing back down the gorge, and beginning the most grueling part of their mission, the escape. The team split up. Ronenberg and his group embarked on an epic 250-mile, 14-day ski trek across the frozen wilderness, finally escaping into neutral Sweden. When the German High Command learned of the raid, they were stunned. They called it the most splendid coup of the war. They had no idea how a handful of men had breached their fortress, destroyed their most valuable asset, and vanished without a single shot being fired. The Nazi atomic bomb program was set back years. By the time they rebuilt the facility, Allied bombers finished the job. The threat was neutralized. The tide of nuclear terror had been turned, not by an army, but by 9 men on skis. By 1943, the tide was turning against the Axis on all fronts. In the East, the Red Army had won at Stalingrad. In the Pacific, the Americans were island hopping. And in the West, the Allies had driven the Germans from North Africa. The next logical step was the invasion of Europe. Winston Churchill called it the soft underbelly, Italy. The Allies planned a massive invasion of the island of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky. There was just one problem. It was too obvious. The Germans knew the Allies were coming. They had heavily reinforced the coastlines of Sicily and mainland Italy, turning the island into a fortress. An Allied invasion would be a predictable frontal assault, a bloodbath. The Allies didn't just need to invade Sicily, they needed the Germans to be looking the other way. This is the story of Operation Mincemeat. It is perhaps the most brilliant, most bizarre, and most macabre deception operation in military history. The plan was not to create a ghost army, but a ghost. The architects were 2 British intelligence officers, Ian Montague and Charles Cholmondeley. Their idea was simple. They would get a dead body, dress him as a British Royal Marines officer, plant fake top-secret documents on him detailing a fictional plan to invade Greece, and then dump the body in the ocean off the coast of Spain, where they knew Nazi-sympathizing officials would find him. The plan was insane. It relied on 1,000 variables. First, they needed a body. They found one. The body of a man named Glyndor Michael, a homeless man who had died in London. They codenamed him Major William Martin. But a body wasn't enough. They had to create a life. For months, Montague and Cholmondeley became Major Martin. They wrote love letters from a fictitious fiancée named Pam, complete with a photograph. They wrote an angry letter from his father. They included 2 stubs from a London theater ticket, a receipt for a new shirt, and a stern letter from his bank manager about his overdraft. They created a living, breathing, slightly careless officer, the kind of man who might be carrying sensitive letters in a briefcase chained to his wrist. And then the letters, the mincemeat itself. They crafted a personal letter from one general to another, which carelessly mentioned that the Allies were planning to invade Greece and Sardinia, and that Sicily was just a feint. On April 30th, 1943, the British submarine HMS Seraph surfaced off the coast of Huelva, Spain. The crew gently lowered the body of Major Martin into the water where the tide would carry him ashore. The Spanish found him. Just as predicted, the secret documents were passed to the local German Abwehr agent, who eagerly photographed them and sent them straight to Berlin. In Berlin, the German High Command analyzed the documents. They looked at the theater stubs. They read the love letters. They saw the official watermarks. It was too personal, too detailed, too real to be a fake. Adolf Hitler himself was convinced. He issued a Führer directive. The measures to be taken in Sardinia and the Peloponnese, Greece, are to be given first priority. He ordered one of his best generals, Erwin Rommel, to Greece. He diverted elite panzer divisions to Sardinia and the Balkans, away from Sicily. He stripped Sicily of its defenses, just when it needed them most. On July 9, 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky. they invaded Sicily. Instead of a meat grinder, they found a front line that was thinly held and poorly supplied. The German and Italian defenders, stunned and overwhelmed, put up a scattered resistance. Sicily fell in just 38 days. The soft underbelly of Europe had been cut wide open. The path into Italy was clear. Mussolini's fascist regime would collapse, and the German war machine would be forced to fight a grueling, resource-draining campaign on a new front. The tide in Europe had turned, all thanks to the man who never was. The invasion of Italy was a success, but it was not the end. To defeat Nazi Germany, the Allies had to land a killing blow. They had to invade France. This was the big one, Operation Overlord. D-Day. The Allies were assembling the largest invasion force in human history in southern England. The problem was, you can't hide 1.5 million men, 5,000 ships, and 11,000 aircraft. The Germans knew the invasion was coming. The only question that mattered, the question upon which the entire war depended, was where. The logical place was the Pas de Calais. It was the shortest distance across the English Channel. It was the quickest route to Germany's industrial heartland. The German High Command, including Rommel, was certain this was the target. They had fortified Calais with their heaviest guns and their best divisions. The Allies needed them to keep believing that, even after the real invasion began. This led to the single largest, most complex, and most successful deception operation ever conceived. Operation Fortitude. If Operation Mincemeat was the creation of one man, Operation Fortitude was the creation of an entire ghost army. The Allies formed the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. FUSAG was, on paper, a massive military force, larger than the actual D-Day invasion group. Its commander was the man the Germans feared most, General George S. Patton. But FUSAG was an army of phantoms. In the fields of East Anglia, across the channel from Calais, the Allies built a fiction. They deployed hundreds of inflatable rubber tanks. They parked fleets of dummy aircraft made of wood and canvas on fake airfields. They built mock-up landing craft in the ports. They generated fake radio traffic, thousands of messages about troop movements, supply requisitions, and Patton's complaints about the food. This dummy radio traffic was designed to be intercepted, analyzed, and believed. But the masterstroke of Operation Fortitude was not the rubber tanks, it was the double agents. Through the double-cross system, British intelligence had captured or turned every single German agent operating in the UK. The most important of these was a Spanish-born agent codenamed Garbo. The Germans trusted Garbo completely. They believed he was their master spy. In reality, he was feeding them a curated script written by British intelligence. In the weeks before D-Day, Garbo sent hundreds of messages confirming German suspicions. He reported on the massive buildup of FUSAG in East Anglia. He detailed Patton's inspection of his troops. He proved that the main assault was coming at Calais. On June 6, 1944, the real invasion began. 156,000 men landed on the beaches of Normandy. In Berlin, the German High Command was frantic, but they were not convinced. This must be the diversion. This was the feint Mincemeat had taught them about. Garbo had warned them this would happen. And so, as the fate of the world hung in the balance on Omaha and Utah beaches, the Germans did the one thing that could guarantee an Allied victory. They did nothing. Hitler refused to release the 15th Army, the powerful Panzer Division stationed at Calais. He kept them there, waiting for Patton's real invasion. For days, then weeks, as the Allies desperately fought to secure their fragile beachhead, the Germans' most powerful forces sat and watched the empty beaches of Calais. Garbo kept the lie going. He sent frantic messages to his German handlers claiming the Normandy landings were a diversion and that the main attack was still coming. The Germans believed him so completely that even in August of 1944, 2 months after D-Day, they awarded him the Iron Cross for his services to the Reich. By the time Hitler realized he had been fooled, it was too late. The Allies had landed millions of men. Paris was liberated. The race to Berlin,
had begun. Operation Fortitude didn't just ensure the D-Day landings were successful, it ensured the landings were possible. It saved tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives and shortened the war by months, if not years. The tide had not just turned, it had become an unstoppable flood. The Second World War was won by the courage of soldiers, the sacrifice of civilians, and the industrial might of nations. But history is more than a ledger of battles won and lost. It is a story of human ingenuity. The war that we remember was a war of force, but the war that changed its outcome was a war of intellect. It was won in a basement in Pearl Harbor by men who translated whispers into victory. It was won on a frozen cliff in Norway by saboteurs who traded their lives for a future free of atomic terror. It was won by a man who never was, a phantom who tricked Hitler and saved an army. And it was won by a ghost army, an illusion of rubber and radio waves that checkmated the Third Reich. These secret operations, these stories you've never been told, are the invisible threads of history. They remind us that the greatest victories are not always won with the loudest bang, but often with the most clever whisper.